Hello, today is going to be an abridged build video of this guy, which is the Halorc Archon V3. See, I have worn it. We're running KISS Ultra, which is obviously the new released flight controller from Alexander Fedorov with BL Heli pass-through and a lot of other features, and a T-Motor F55 Pro 2. So what I'm going to do is basically take you kind of step by step without all the tedious soldering bits as to how I've built this guy, set up KISS, and then obviously you can flip back to the previous video, which was me testing everything was hunky-dory. Right, so here's the frame in its bare laid out initial stage before I've done any build work. So we've got the T-Motor F55 Pro 2, which has already been tinned up with solder because it came out of another quad. The Vista is sat on the back and just bolted with M2 screws and little nuts on the top to keep it in place. The TPU mounts here are now purple to match the motors, as is the camera insert, and that's just because this is the updated camera mount which fits with the slightly redesigned top plate that I mentioned in my initial review, and these little camera inserts fit the in this case Nebula Pro a little bit better than the DJI standard cam, which are the grey ones. There's not much difference, but they're just marginally different. So what I'm really doing at this stage is I've just attached the camera, stuck the Vista in, ESC is sat roughly where I want it, and I'm just getting an idea of how I'm going to lay this guy out. Now, a couple of issues I've got on this particular frame, because these motors came from a different quad. As sod's law would have it, the motor wires are too short. So I had two choices here: one, extend the motor wires, or two, the ESC comes with a race wire. And so what I'm likely going to do is basically just use the race wire to attach the wires, and that will give me some spare wire. And in terms of other bits, I'm going to be using the Vifly buzzer. I think this is the micro or the mini, the latest one, which is a little bit smaller. That's going to sit just at the back like so. And the capacitor, in this case I'm using a Panasonic 35 volt 1000 UF capacitor, and I'm going to be running 6S, and that is absolutely fine. Some people use 50 volt, I don't see the need, but whatever floats your boat. And that fits nicely at the front in this elongated nose. So what I will be doing is just attaching it there and then using these extended wires, which I think are either 18 or 20 gauge wire, just to attach it to the motor pads. Obviously, in my case, we're going to be using crossfire nano. That's just going to sit at the front because the top plate has this hole, and basically the mount for if I can find one, yeah, for basically the immortal T antenna, which will go like so. This top plate, as I said, just pivots on basically the standoff, but I've removed it just because it's a fag to film with it in place. Otherwise I would have just built with it on. So it's a nicely laid out frame. There isn't a huge amount to do because we're using DJI. Obviously we're going to be using the KISS flight controller, in this case the new Fedorov flight controller, what's it called, the Fedor Commander KISS flight controller. This is going to be sort of underutilized in this particular build, and Fedorov's probably going to hate me for doing this, but really I should have done this as an analog build. But after faffing around doing the initial video with analog, it's just sort of sealed in my mind that I'm done and dusted with analog unless I have to use it on smaller quads. So we're going to use digital. And BL heli pass-through is now working with this ESC with a KISS flight controller, or should I say the KISS Ultra flight controller, so we can fiddle around in BL heli and set these motors up as we wish. So what I'm going to do first of all is just solder these wires to my ESC. I'm just going to quickly look at the layout of the flight controller and make sure that, or check which way around it's going to go, and then I may move the ESC depending on which way works best, because essentially what I want is whichever side of this flight controller has the crossfire connectors, I want that at the front, because I don't want to be trailing wires backwards and forwards. So I'm going to have a look at that layout. I'm going to solder my wires to the front of this ESC. Dead easy, it doesn't matter which way round you solder any of these particular wires, because we can change the motor order later on. Right, front motor wires are soldered on. There's a lot of snobbery about soldering. It's not particularly hard. You just apply the hot pointy end, 60-40 or thereabouts, tin lead solder, and off you go. As long as they're on properly, it doesn't really matter how pretty your solder joints are. My eyesight's crap these days, so that's about as good as mine's really going to get. As long as you haven't bridged any of the pads, there's nothing to worry about. In terms of the ESC, I tend to always use my ESCs this way. They are designed to have these motor pads at the back and obviously have the motor connectors at the sides, but I just think it makes for a neater and tidier build if you run it sort of twisted round 90 degrees. And all we'll basically do when we've attached the rest of the motor wires is just attach the pigtail. Plus on your XT60 is always the flat side, and on the CSC Plus is there. So again, I'm just going to attach the pigtail for the XT60 battery connected to there, and to decide which one of these guys I'm going to be using. Whichever ones of these I decide to use, what I'll do is, even though this one appears to be coated on the back, I'm just going to add some double-sided foam tape, in this case 3M, to A, stick it to the arm, and B, to stop this surface from being in connection with the carbon, because although this top plate, or should I say this top part, is sort of laminated and not conductive, you don't want it being scratched, potentially shorting anything out, and it'll just hold it nicely in place. Right, jumping forward a little bit, I've soldered my motor wires to my ESC. I've added the XT60 flat end, as I said, is positive, and I've actually soldered it to the underneath of this ESC, simply because I've got plenty of space to do that, and that just gives me some nice clean pads which I can use to attach the capacitor. As you can see, I've used the T-motor race wire, and as I've left this one open so you can see it, you obviously just connect the wires to either end of it, and the race wire is just sat on some 3M foam tape just to keep it in place. And then all I've done is wrapped fabric tape around it, really just to protect those joints. The fabric tape I'm using is also sometimes called loom tape. Obviously you can just use normal tape, insulation tape, but I got this just to see if it looked any nicer. Not sure it does, but yeah, that was the idea. So as always, now that everything is connected to the ESCs, or should I say that the motors are connected, I'm just going to take my multimeter, put it on continuity mode, and just make sure I don't have a solid beep, which would indicate a short. And again, that short beep is nothing to worry about, that's just the ESC charging up. And again, just to play safe, I'll take a smoke stopper, connect it to the ESC, and again just plug a battery in Yep, so we've heard the chimes. That green light didn't turn off, so there's no obvious shorts on the connections. So we're good to move to the next stage, which, as I said, is in this particular case, is attaching this Panasonic 35 volt 1000 UF capacitor to the ESC. And as you can see, I've just wrapped it in some shrink wrap and attached essentially motor wire to the short terminals. You want to cut those terminals as close as you can and still be able to solder onto it, because they don't conduct very well, not as well as the actual wire does. And as I said, this is just going to sit on this nose section here, as there's room to do that, and we'll just attach the wire directly to the battery pads like so. So again, all I'm going to do, get it roughly where I want it, make sure that I've got the right wires. So the gold bit is negative, which in this case is going to be to there. So I'm just going to shorten the wires to where I want them and then solder it to that ESC. Right, capacitor's in its temporary home. Obviously I've left it loose for now so I can get the receiver in. So the next stage of things I want to do is I want to power this vista directly from the ESC pad. And on the vista, from top to bottom, you've basically got power, ground, RX and TX. So obviously power and ground we're going to send, so there's corresponding pads on the ESC, and the green and white wire will connect directly to the KISS flight controller via one of the plugs. Obviously this one's already soldered up because I've taken it out of another quad, but you can see essentially what you're going to be doing, and you just need a 6-pin connector if you're going to use the plugs on the KISS Ultra board. Right, that's kind of major stage of the build done. All the sort of key components are now sat on the quad. The Vista is now powered from obviously VBAT on the ESC. All we need to do now is take the flight controller and start obviously wiring that up and adding the receiver, and in my case the little Vifly buzzer that I'm going to be using, which is somewhere around here that I can't find in my messy workbench. This is the wiring harness that came with the ESC, and I've just spliced the wires that I want onto the pin connector that came with the KISS Ultra. Now this ESC has got a lot of stuff on it that I don't particularly want to use. It's got a 10 volt regulator, don't want that because ESC regulators tend to be noisy. It's got a current sensor, can't use that because KISS only uses digital. And there's various gubbins including VBAT, which again I've chosen not to use. So the only wires I'm running from this ESC are the 4, in this case white motor wires, and the blue wire is a telemetry wire. And again, white wires into the connector on the KISS flight controller and blue wire into the telemetry. I haven't used VBAT to run straight to the flight controller as I happily could have done, because I prefer to power flight controllers directly from the battery pads on the ESC. And there's no particular reason why I couldn't have powered via this connector here, but in my mind, if I'm connecting my capacitor directly to this point here, and I know that my battery is connecting and running current and voltage through this point here, to me that seems like the best point to pick up battery voltage rather than whatever goes on around the houses in here and pumps out the other side. Again, no real reason why I have to do that, but it's just one of the little million things that people pick up as their own preferences along their build journey, and that's how I like to do mine. So all I'm going to do is attach a little strip of positive and negative wire to this ESC, and then power it directly to the flight control to give, or should I say, to give the flight controller power. In terms of board orientation, I'm going to run mine like so, and you'll notice if you look at the KISS logo here, that's back to front. And the only reason I'm doing it that way is it just works better for me. I've got enough room this side for all my connectors, and this side it keeps my USB ports nice and clear rather than having battery wire flapping around. Again, it doesn't really matter which way you run it as long as it doesn't impact and hit any other components. So all I'll do in the configurator later on is tell the flight controller it's running back to front and reverse the yaw axis by 180 degrees. And with regards to the vista wiring, the white wire is connected to the Vista RX pad, so that will go to the flight controller TX pad, and the green wire is connected to the RX pad, and that will go to the, or should I say, the green wire is connected to the TX pad, and that will go to the RX pad of the flight controller, which is like so, and they're both going into TX and RX3, which is just those little connectors there, and all I'll do is route that through and under here and pop it out at the side beneath the flight controller where it's out of the way. Right, crossfire receiver is in, and if you notice that this top plate is just perfectly wide enough to sandwich the crossfire in between it, and it just nicely sits between the front standoff of this nose and my motor wires. And as I said before, the idea of this guy is your crossfire antenna you will simply run via the slot on the back of this mount, and if you notice, the top plate has been designed just wide enough that you can basically push your crossfire antenna through it. If we move on to this flight controller, there's not a huge amount of soldering to do, so we're basically just going to connect the receiver to ground, 5V, RX and TX. We've got our buzzer pads, which I'll need here. So we've got buzzer plus minus, and we'll pick up a ground as well. And then on the other side of the board, where it says, if I can get my camera to focus, battery max 6S, you can see we've got plus and minus, which we're going to use to connect the battery voltage. So all I'm going to do is solder this guy up and connect the corresponding wires. TX from the receiver goes to RX on the flight controller, and vice versa for the other connectors. Right, receiver is in, green wire is going to, what is that? Green wire is going to TX, yellow wire RX, red 5V, black ground. And our quad is essentially finished. The only thing left to add is a buzzer. If I just move this flight controller out of the way, I've just ran a zip tie through this standoff, which is just going to help secure my capacitor. And I'm just going to add some sticky tape or foam tape underneath this capacitor to just secure it in place, and then zip tie over the top. Slight change of plan. Instead of wiring directly to these, or should I say, instead of powering the flight controller directly from 6S into these two pads here, I've just added some wire onto this connector just to make life a little bit simpler. I'm just going to solder it directly onto the ESC pads as I intended to do. This end part of the video is made about 10 days later than the rest of the video that you've seen, and the reason for that is when I came to test things, I bumped into a number of issues which took me ages to sort out. Number one, I couldn't get MSP or the DJI OSD to work for love nor money, and I tried everything I could possibly think of, changed flight controllers, rebuilt the entire quad, did a million things, and it appears that the diodes, or possibly TVS, within the vista, which protect it from overcurrent, have died. So basically, because they're not working, I'm losing MSP, and I don't get the OSD anymore. And it took ages to figure that out. Potentially I can remove those 3 diodes or TVS, whatever they are, and the MSP should then work. But by doing that, I'll remove the internal protection from over voltage, for basically getting to the CPU or MCU. So if I run that particular vista, which I've now taken out, and I get it working again, I'll have to be super careful and make sure it's got, you know, the quad that I'm using as a spike absorber, and it's, you know, got a fairly hefty cap on it, so it'll be a little bit risky. But that took a lot of time. The second issue, which is more annoying, is this quad, when I tested it, worked fine, but it has a strange quirk. If you heard it, it gives the initial startup tones for BL Heli twice, so you get that duh, and then it immediately does it again. And I spent ages going around the houses trying to correct this problem, trying different ESC settings, refleshing the flight controller. I've repinned the connectors on this quad a million times, thinking I had a power issue, powered the flight controller a million different ways, and it was only talking to Alexander Fedorov, and he said that because the Ultra obviously has this H7 processor and the OSD and all the rest of it, it's taking a fraction of a second longer to boot up than a normal flight controller would do, so not to worry about it and go and fly. Now, because I just didn't want to, you know, immediately think everything was all hunky-dory, what I did is basically put this quad together, went out and flew all those packs you saw the other day, and he's absolutely right, it flies great with no issue, but it was just really confusing me and really delayed me because I was constantly thinking I had some sort of glitch or problem or power issue. He's literally just sent me a new hex through, actually, which removes the double startup tones, so he's obviously worked out what it is already, and I'm guessing that will go public any day now. In terms of changes, well, obviously I put a new vista in, and this one came with a black camera. The mount that came with the quad was 30 degrees, so in the meantime I've slightly bodged together a lower angle one. I tend to prefer about 25 degrees. The only other thing I've really done is added self-locking nuts on top of the vista, and sat the vista on a couple of M2 nylon nuts, which allowed me to pass the wiring for the vista and also the buzzer that I've added at the back underneath it, and just make it a little bit cleaner. The buzzer wire is basically red is positive, black is negative, and the white is a signal wire. And on KISS, as you can see, if I just go in, basically positive signal, and I've just piggybacked the ground here. The only additional change I've made is because we've now got analog current sensing in an update, I've just popped in a wire, sorry for knocking the camera here, on this T-Motor ESC from the current pad, and I've wired that to the camera control pad here, which now gives us analog current sensing, which I'll come on to in the OSD video. And that is essentially it. Nothing more towards it than that. Really straightforward build beyond the fact that I had all these issues. So it's really just a case of obviously putting it back together again. And this particular quad, you'll slide the antenna through this hole. Just be careful because it's a really tight fit, and put it back together again, which I'll do now. And there she is, buttoned up. Not a bad looking quad. All done and ready to crash a million times again. So this next part is just going to be basically a quick guide through KISS and how I've set my particular quad up. So this is the first page of the KISS Ultra GUI, and you can download that if you scan the QR code on the box that your KISS Ultra came to. It will take you to the GitHub page where you can get that. So these are the rates and PIDs that I flew on my flight footage the other day. Nothing to stop you flying with the defaults, but that's just where I started from. Obviously in my case I'm using a TBS Crossfire. In your case you'll just choose whatever receiver you're using. Nothing really changed here. Min throttle, max throttle, mid throttle, all standard. And I'm using D-Shot 2400 because obviously this is an F3 processor and it can use it. Obviously aux channels I've just set up for my TBS Tango 2, and a low pass filter I'm using high in this case, which in KISS speak basically means the lowest. You can switch it off, but on Ultra it didn't like it on my quad. I have had it running off on other quads, but I don't recommend that. On the top left here, this is basically your motor orientation, or basically telling KISS how you've set your ESC up. If you look at this diagram here, you'll notice that KISS has a different motor layout than Betaflight, and if you're coming from Betaflight and you've wired your ESC up as per the pinout guide, you can simply select BF for Betaflight and it will essentially just change it to the Betaflight setup. I personally quite often find that you have to sort of go through a million of these different setups to find the way that you've laid yours out, and in this particular case, because I had to sort of semi-rebuild it and I repinned that connector about 453,000 times. By the time I got to here, I had no idea which motor was going where, so I just changed it in the OSD, which I'll show you a little bit later, and it's far easier to do that. In advanced, we're using custom orientation, and because I've put the flight controller in backwards, I've just changed the yaw angle by 180 degrees to tell KISS that obviously that's the correct orientation. Reverse yaw control, reverse motor, is if you want to run props out at the front. I run motors spinning inwards, just a standard setup, but if you prefer to run it reverse, then you can choose it that. Launch mode essentially allows you to hold your quad at sort of like a 45-degree angle, as if you were about to do a racing start. Not sure how many people would use that. Obviously RX deadband, if you've got particularly jittery pitch roll, yaw, etc., you can just dial that out by adding a couple of points into any of these. The setup that we've got here, which you can see I've clicked use advanced serial configuration, are just the defaults, by the fact that I've chosen DJI MSP on serial number 3 or UART number 3. Obviously if you'd have connected yours to a different serial, then just click whichever one and set it up for whichever one you're using. Obviously I'm not using a black box logger, don't need to worry about any of that. Emulate with motors buzzer, same as it is on Betaflight. Your buzzer will sound, your motors will chime on a switch. And the rest of this I just left standard. So set point weight in D term is 100. In KISS basic speak, that's your elastic band. At 100, that elastic band will snap back as quick as it can. If you reduced it to 30 for argument's sake, you'd have a very sloppy, loose quad. I tend to sort of run 85 to 90 on KISS V2, but I've left this at 100 and it flew fine. Obviously all these I've left just standard, there's no reason to mess around with them, and because I'm using DJI, I've just chosen the layout that I prefer. Because I'm in the UK, I'm using Imperial. Most people will use metric, and you can just choose whether you want it at the top, bottom, all around, etc. And KISS return to home, we don't need to worry about here because we're not using GPS. I have done a video about all these different settings way back, so knock yourself out. Data output is obviously just your sticks, make sure everything is centered at 1500 or thereabouts and that your min or max are 2000. And in KISS, this is where you will test your motors. So unlike beta flight, in KISS you need to use your TX or your radio to test your motors. So you will basically just enable motor test, click the particular motor you want to test according to this diagram, and then just use the throttle on your radio to spin that motor. And if your motors are in the wrong configuration, then as I said, the easiest way to sort this is just to go into the OSD, and as we said in earlier videos, doesn't matter whether your quad is analog or digital, doesn't matter whether it's powered on, as long as it's getting 5 volt, because anything that we do in here will be live when we fly our quad. So I'll just yaw down and to the left, and in flight controller setup, if I roll right, if I go into here, D-shot output routing, and I refer back to that pinout, generally speaking this would be 1, 2, 3, 4. As you can see, I've just changed mine to 1, 2, 4, 3, and you can select these by sort of roll and pitch and pull back on your sticks, which is select, and then change them to obviously any numbers that you wish to do so. So going back into here, if motor 1 and motor 2 were the wrong way around, you could just switch them over within that OSD. It's really easy to do. This page we don't really need to look at, it's just really a duplication with a graph of that initial page. TPA we don't need to look at. So if we flip back to the OSD and go back into it, and I think I need to disconnect and go back in again. If I go back to the OSD and I go into FC setup and scroll along to advanced, which is here, and then page up, this is where you will set your current sensor if you've wired it up to the camera control pad like I did. So if I select that, you can see that you've got options camera control or current sensor. Obviously I'm not using camera control, I didn't even really use it very often when I used analog, to be honest with you, but you need to sacrifice camera control currently to get your current sensor working. Current sensor divider is where you'll put the maths behind the current sensor setup. So if I just go back and go down to hardware tools, these are all the setups that you can obviously do. The one we want is current calibration. And on here, what you'll essentially do is fly a pack and make a note of what milliamp hours the OSD is telling you you've used. You will then take that battery, plug it in to your charger, charge it up, make a note, and put the milliamp hours in that you've used. And that will give you a figure here which you can put in that previous screen that I was on, which is in flight controller setup, and again just there. So you will just put in that number there. So I suppose what you're going to have to do if you're using DJI is, like I am, I'm probably going to have to take a laptop or something just to fly one pack. Dive into the OSD on here at the end of that pack, pick it up, I'm guessing, and then put it in. Obviously analog pilots, you won't have that issue. And lastly but not leastly, before you do any of this, you want to update your flight controller because he's making updates all the time. This is the latest one. Obviously you can see he's fixed a lot of different stuff and added the current sensor jazz in that we just spoke about. And that is pretty much that. It's really simple. The only complication you'll have is around motor order. And like always, if you want to change the direction of your motors, you will basically just come out of here, dive in to BL Heli, connect as you normally would do via Betaflight, And if I just plug in a battery, and read setup, you can see it's picked up my T-Motor F55 Pro 2, and these are the settings that I flew the other day. 48k PWM frequency, nothing here has really changed. Obviously this is where you will choose your motor direction, and obviously you can select which ESC you want to change it, like so. The only other thing I would say is I've got motor timing on auto, and that's basically just the way that I tend to fly initially with a new setup. Generally most people will run motor timing maybe 22, 23, tends to be a good level. A lot of people, certainly more sort of snappy S-bang pilots, I'm thinking Blackbird and people like that, will run much higher motor timing, possibly 28 or even up to 30, and that can give you a more responsive motor and more power, but at the expense of additional heat. So if you are going to ramp your motor timing up beyond 22, 23, just obviously check your motors. When I was flying, my motors were stone cold, so the next time I take this quad out, I'll probably start at 23. Although to be honest with you, it flew so well, it's debatable whether I'm even going to bother, but I suppose I should do just to see if it gets any better. And that is that. So KISS is really easy to work with once you understand the differences between it and Betaflight. Obviously Betaflight has more bells and whistles, but what you need to understand coming to KISS is that the removal of those bells and whistles in some cases may feel frustrating, but once you actually get out there and start flying it, you'll realise in most cases that you don't need those bells and whistles, simply because for most people on most quads, and I'm talking here 5-inch freestyle quads, although it's worked beautifully on even 3-inch sort of lightweight quads for me in the past, much better than Beta, but on the sort of target market that it was designed for, 5-inch freestyle carrying a Hero or a Session, I'd be surprised if many people didn't find it immediately more intuitive and easier to fly than Betaflight. Only the people who are really into tuning to the nth degree, I think, will get more out of Betaflight than they can KISS, but obviously whatever floats your own boat. So that is it for me now. I'll leave you with a little bit of flight footage from the other day. As you can see, it's after my million crashes, so excuse the crap all over my Hero lens. But anyway, that's it. Cheers, guys. Thanks. Bye-bye.